Where do we find an investor? And the perfect investor? Britain. Israeli historian Ilan Pape notes that British officials, Balfour, Churchill, and Herbert Samuel, consistently referred to the native population as Arabs or Mohammedans in their correspondence. But back then, Arab didn't mean what it does today. It was a colonial shorthand for Bedouins or backward people, conjuring images of camels and tents. And Mohammedans? That wasn't just a religious label, it was a way of describing people as mere followers of Muhammad, rather than adherents of a sophisticated civilization. The British saw Palestinians as just another nameless, insignificant indigenous group, accidentally living in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Churchill himself later put it bluntly. He once explained using a chilling analogy, just because a dog has been sleeping in a manger for a long time doesn't mean it owns the manger. And who, according to Churchill, had the rightful claim to the land? The civilized Europeans, whether British or Jewish. With that mindset driving policy, Jewish immigration continued unchecked. By 1935, Jews had grown from just 3% of the population to a staggering 27%. The resistance never stopped, resistance against British colonial oppression. One of the most notable figures in the fight was a young Syrian scholar from Al-Azhar who went from being a preacher at Haifa's Independence Mosque to leading an armed uprising against the British. His name was Izz ad-Din al-Qassam. Thousands of volunteers joined him, supplying him with weapons and ammunition. But eventually, the British forces managed to kill him in a completely one-sided battle. His funeral, however, ignited a movement across Palestine, which later escalated into a full-scale strike from April to October 1936, the spark that set off the Great Arab Revolt. The British were in shock. Maybe they hadn't expected what they saw as the dog in the manger to fight back. Between 1936 and 1937, they killed 1,000 Palestinians and arrested anyone involved in the revolt. And listen to this. After arresting them, they demolished their homes. Just in Jaffa alone, over 200 houses were reduced to rubble. Meanwhile, Britain handed Jewish settlers everything they needed, facilitating their immigration, establishing strong, self-sufficient Jewish communities with institutions and infrastructure, all while systematically crushing the Palestinian Revolution and eliminating its leadership. By 1940, 10% of Palestinian men were either dead, exiled, or imprisoned. On top of that, Britain instilled racist colonial ideologies, shaping how they ruled over the land. In short, the British taught the Zionists all the wrong lessons, but one lesson remained. No way, don't say it. They taught them how to smoke cigarettes? No, my friend. They taught them the art of colonization. Why not, the Zionist movement thought. Indeed, Zionist colonial ambitions grew stronger, and the British didn't just encourage it, they actively helped develop the military capabilities necessary to turn these ambitions into reality. In 1937, the Peel Commission proposed partitioning Palestine between 1 million Arabs and 400,000 Jews, giving 1/3 of the land to the Jewish minority. But there was a problem. Palestinians were literally everywhere, meaning they would still form a majority even within the proposed Jewish state. That's when Churchill stood before the commission and said, "The inhabitants of Palestine are dogs in the manger, so we will remove them." Britain never officially implemented the Peel Commission's plan, but it wanted to. According to Oxford historian Eugene Rogan, this was the first time an official body explicitly proposed the idea of forced displacement. Not just buying land and building isolated settlements, but physically expelling people and creating ethnically homogeneous spaces for others. Now, do you think it stopped there? The Zionist movement's colonial ambitions only grew. Ben-Gurion and other Zionist leaders must have sat down and thought, you know what? This whole expulsion idea is actually great, but why stop at 1/3 of Palestine? Why not take all of it? Later, the head of the Jewish agency, Joseph Weitz, would openly admit that Zionist settlers had become more ambitious. So much so that their vision started exceeding even the British colonial project itself. But there was another lesson the Zionists learned from the British. Violence was the key to achieving their goals. Between 1937 and 1939, Jewish militias carried out unprecedented terror attacks. Come on, you're exaggerating, right? You mean terror in a figurative sense? No, my friend, literal terrorism, the kind you hear about on the news. They planted car bombs in Haifa and Jerusalem markets, killing over 70 Palestinians, all under British supervision. For this episode, we've specifically used Israeli sources. So, what did Britain do while all of this was happening right under its nose? It increased its military presence in Palestine to 25,000 soldiers, killed 5,000 Palestinians, and arrested 9,000 others, under conditions that Eugene Rogan described as nothing short of concentration camps. And yet, despite all of this British support and protection, Britain, like all empires, wasn't going to last forever. The Zionists knew that to secure their future they needed their own independent military force, so their fate wouldn't always be tied to Britain's, especially when what you'd call a conflict of interest started to emerge. Because when World War II broke out in 1939, Britain, listen to this, decided to limit Jewish immigration to Palestine to just 15,000 people per year in an attempt to ease tensions in the Arab world. Shocking, right? Britain's focus had shifted. There was a world war raging and they had a much bigger problem on their hands, Hitler. And let's be clear, at that time, the persecution of Jews in Europe was very real. Now you might think this would cause a rift between the Zionist movement and Britain, but surprisingly, the opposite happened. At the start of the war, 15,000 Jewish soldiers enlisted in the British Army to fight in World War II. Why is this important? Because they gained invaluable experience. Think about it. These fighters were now training alongside the British military against the German war machine. That's top-tier combat training. And over time, those underground Zionist groups that had been carrying out terror attacks, they began to transform into organized military units, the most infamous being Haganah, along with groups like Irgun and Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang. Haganah evolved from a militant group into a full-fledged army, complete with an air force. And according to historian Ilan Pappé, once the Zionist movement had a structured military, their mindset shifted. Why just force the Arabs out when we can wipe them out? Why exile them when we can eliminate them? Because let's be real, these people don't stop fighting, they don't stop revolting, and even if we drive them out, they'll come back. This land belongs to us, and us alone. While the British Army was fighting conventional battles, Zionist militias were being trained in a different kind of warfare. British General Ord Wingate was the first to train Jewish fighters in village takeovers and guerrilla warfare, what's known as urban combat. According to Ilan Pappé, this man was the one who implanted the idea of ethnic cleansing into Zionist doctrine. So much so that Israeli military leader Moshe Dayan later called him our first teacher. At the same time, Zionist groups started meticulously studying the geography of every Palestinian village, its roads, entry points, and exits, all in preparation for future raids and purges. Historian Ilan Pappé calls this the Village Files Project. Meanwhile, European Jewish immigrants had grown stronger. They now had a trained army, strategic knowledge, and a growing sense of frustration. Sure, Britain is an ally, but this war is delaying our plans in Palestine. Can you believe it? They're actually restricting Jewish immigration. Disgraceful. This sparked a major divide among Zionists. One camp, led by David Ben-Gurion, believed that while British policies were frustrating, Britain was still a valuable ally. On the other side, groups like Irgun and Lehi saw Britain as an obstacle to their goal of a Jewish state. Tensions escalated dramatically when the French ship Patria arrived near Haifa carrying 1,800 Jewish refugees, without British approval. The Zionist underground blew up part of the ship, sacrificing 240 Jewish passengers in a calculated move to force British authorities to accept the remaining refugees. You might be wondering, wait, they bombed their own people? Just to pressure Britain? Yes, and it gets even darker. The Lehi, or Stern Gang, actually attempted to ally with the Nazis. Let that sink in. The very people carrying out the Holocaust, the mass genocide of European Jews. Zionist extremists met with Nazi officials in Lebanon to explore an alliance, believing it would serve their interests. This isn't speculation, this is documented by Eugene Rogan, a professor of Middle Eastern history at Oxford University. By the end of World War II, Zionist leaders saw the writing on the wall. Even if Britain won the war, it would never reclaim its former status as a global empire. As historian Vivienne Forrester puts it in her book The Western Crime, post-war Europe was shattered. It was so devastated that most European nations cut back on accepting Jewish refugees, effectively trapping them in Nazi-controlled territories. She calls this Hitler's trap. Zionist leaders understood this perfectly. They saw that if they needed a real ally, one with actual power, it wouldn't be Britain, it had to be a new superpower outside of Europe. The answer? The United States of America. In 1942, the Zionist movement held the Biltmore Conference in the U.S., rallying support from American political and business elites. The key message? The New World Order after the war must include a Jewish state, an open homeland for all Jews worldwide. This was a pivotal shift. The Zionist movement began positioning itself as an essential player in global politics, offering itself as the perfect solution to Europe's Jewish problem while simultaneously becoming a strategic ally to the world's emerging superpower, the United States. And from that moment on, history was set on a new path. Here, my friend, you ask me, why did America, still in the middle of World War II, agree to play the role of the new sponsor? The truth is, as I told you before, America is perhaps the one country in the world that truly understands the Zionist dream. In her memoir, Hard Choices, former U.S. presidential candidate Hillary Clinton wrote that most Americans are descendants of immigrants who fled their homelands in pursuit of a dream in a distant land. She explains that while Americans may not be the chosen people, they would at least be their allies, the ones who would help them realize their dream, just as they had realized their own. Beyond ideology, America had a strategic interest in having an ally like Israel in the Middle East, so in many ways it was a win-win situation, and so a new alliance was forged between the Zionist movement and the United States. Funding began flowing in, to the point where the Haganah even established its own weapons factories. Naturally, the British watched all this unfold in shock. They realized that their historical deal with the Zionists had been one-sided. It had been unrequited love, a toxic relationship. Imagine Britain investing in the Zionist project for years, believing it had a loyal partner, only to discover that Zionism never had Britain in its plans at all. Britain had been feeding and raising a beast, convinced it held the leash, only to look down and realize there was no leash, and the beast, it was already turning against its creator. By 1946, the Irgun carried out one of its most infamous attacks, the bombing of the King David Hotel, the British administrative headquarters, 200 kilograms of explosives, 91 dead Brits. In 1947, the Irgun bombed the Officers' Club in Jerusalem. Then came the infamous Exodus ship, carrying 4,500 Holocaust survivors desperate to enter Palestine. The British denied them entry, insisting this exceeds the allowed quota, and sent the ship back to France. Riots erupted. In retaliation, the Irgun kidnapped 2 British soldiers and hanged them in the fields of Netanya, sending a clear message: we no longer need you. The irony? The leader of the Irgun, the man Britain had declared a wanted terrorist, was none other than Menachem Begin. Yes, that Menachem Begin, the future Prime Minister of Israel. A man who would go on to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Can you imagine? A man Britain once labeled a terrorist would one day receive the Nobel Peace Prize. During the final years of British rule, Zionist groups carried out over 500 acts of terrorism, killing more than 169 British soldiers and officials. Banks, infrastructure, even postal services, nothing was off limits. They introduced the world to a chilling new form of terror parcel bombs. A simple package delivered to your door. You open it. Boom! Delivery terrorism. Innovative, right? The impact on Britain was profound. In response, across England, there were retaliatory attacks on over 300 Jewish establishments. And in a surreal twist, some Britons even raised Nazi swastikas, calling for the expulsion of Jews. Let that sink in. This was England, barely 2 years after World War II, where people had fought and died to defeat the Nazis. And yet, in the chaos of Palestine, the British suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of Zionist terror. Even more absurd? Despite deploying 75,000 soldiers in Palestine, the British didn't crack down on Zionist militias. Instead, they arrested over 300 Palestinians for carrying weapons. The historian Avi Shlaim summed it up perfectly. The British mandate had a moral obligation to resist the Zionist takeover and prevent the displacement of Palestinians. But by 1947, Britain had decided it was done losing soldiers over this conflict. So what did it do? It dumped the entire mess on the United Nations, Here you deal with it, my back hurts. British historian Eugene Rogan put it bluntly, the country that prides itself on fighting terrorism was ultimately driven out by terrorism. Again, my friend, that's not me saying it, that's Mr. Eugene Rogan, the legend of David and Goliath. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations issued Resolution 181, partitioning Palestine into 6 regions, 3 for Arabs, 3 for Jews, with Jerusalem placed under international supervision. This plan allocated 56% of the land to the Jewish state, even though the Jewish population was significantly smaller than the Palestinian one. In 1947, Palestine was home to 1.2 million Palestinians and 600,000 Jews. Palestinians legally owned 94% of the land, including 80% of agricultural land. Yet the partition plan granted the Jewish minority the majority of the land, 56%, even though they had controlled only 6% before. While the plan expanded Zionist territory, it failed to create ethnically homogeneous Jewish cities, leaving places like Jaffa and Haifa, predominantly Arab, within the Jewish state. Historian Ilan Pape notes that at the time, no one in the world could have imagined that a national liberation movement in Palestine would be forced to share land with colonial settlers. But from the very beginning, Zionism's core objective was clear: Jews must not live alongside others. Over time, the Zionist dream expanded, not just to claim a part of Palestine but all of it. The military balance, before 1948. When British forces withdrew, General Darcy assessed the military situation. The Jewish agency effectively controlled all of Palestine. The Haganah, a well-organized paramilitary force, had 35,000 fighters. The Palmach, an elite commando unit, had over 10,000 soldiers. The Irgun and Stern Gang were highly trained, battle-hardened militant groups. Meanwhile, on the Arab side, the situation was drastically different. Arab nations had just emerged from wars and colonial occupations, leaving their armies weak and uncoordinated. The Arab League opened recruitment for volunteers, forming the Army of Salvation, an improvised force of 4,000 fighters. Despite their passion and dedication, they lacked organization and modern military capabilities. Even within Palestine, resistance was fragmented, with leaders like Abdelkader al-Husseini, Fawzi al-Kawuchi, and Hassan Salameh leading separate, uncoordinated operations. While Palestinians and Arabs attempted to reject partition, Zionist militias were preparing something far more dangerous. The blueprint for ethnic cleansing. By late 1947, before Israel's declaration or the 1948 war, the Haganah was already meeting to put its infamous Plan Dalet, Plan D, into action. A blueprint for mass ethnic cleansing. But before executing this plan on a large scale, they needed a test run, a rehearsal. On February 15, 1948, Yitzhak Rabin, who would later win a Nobel Peace Prize, led an attack on the Palestinian village of Kasaria near Haifa. The assault drove out 1,500 residents, a pattern soon repeated across 5 other villages. The purpose? Assess the combat effectiveness of Zionist forces, ensure that British forces still present in Palestine would not intervene. Terror as a strategy, the massacre of Deir Yassin. The strategy took a horrific turn on April 9, 1948, in the peaceful village of Deir Yassin, home to 700 Palestinians including farmers, merchants, 2 schools, a mosque, and a sports club. That day, Zionist militias stormed the village, slaughtering 250 men, women, and children, 1/3 of the population. Entire families were massacred as survivors watched in horror, knowing they would be next. The British police station just 3 kilometers away did nothing. This calculated act of terror led to mass panic, forcing 75,000 Palestinians to flee Jaffa, Haifa, and Jerusalem. Ethnic cleansing did not stop at murder and expulsion. It extended to erasing Palestinian history itself. Less than 1 kilometer from Deir Yassin, the newly founded State of Israel built Yad Vashem, a museum dedicated to the Holocaust. As Palestinian author Emil Habibi once said, the victims were erased as if they never existed. The British role handing over a state as Zionist militias terrorized Palestinian villages. The British Mandate authorities systematically handed over ports, railways, and government buildings, 2,700 structures, 50 railway stations, 3,000 kilometers of roads, and 37 fully equipped military bases. In short, the British didn't just leave, they built the foundation of the Zionist state and then walked away. The Nakba, a manufactured refugee crisis. The Zionist narrative claims that the Palestinian refugee crisis resulted from Arab leaders telling Palestinians to flee, promising they could return after the war. But historian Ilan Pape debunks this myth. Half of all Palestinian refugees were already expelled before the war even began in May 1948. Of the 530 villages destroyed during the Nakba, half were ethnically cleansed before May 1948. Historian Avi Shlaim further confirms that the refugee crisis did not result from war, but was already in motion months before. The creation of Israel, a David versus Goliath myth. On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel was officially declared. The military balance, before 1948. When British forces withdrew, General Darcy assessed the military situation. The Jewish agency effectively controlled all of Palestine. The Haganah, a well-organized paramilitary force, had 35,000 fighters. The Palmach, an elite commando unit, had over 10,000 soldiers. The Irgun and Stern Gang were highly trained, battle-hardened militant groups. Meanwhile, on the Arab side, the situation was drastically different. Arab nations had just emerged from wars and colonial occupations, leaving their armies weak and uncoordinated. The Arab League opened recruitment for volunteers, forming the Army of Salvation, an improvised force of 4,000 fighters. Despite their passion and dedication, they lacked organization and modern military capabilities. Even within Palestine, resistance was fragmented, with leaders like Abdelkader al-Husseini, Fazi al-Kawuchi, and Hassan Salameh leading separate, uncoordinated operations. While Palestinians and Arabs attempted to reject partition, Zionist militias were preparing something far more dangerous. The myth of the only democracy in the Middle East. In 1948, David Ben-Gurion, a man who spent his childhood in Poland before migrating, didn't just fulfill a dream, he became its founder, or as the Zionists would later call him, the principal architect of the state. A dream he described as a 100% Jewish state with no Arabs, a pure society exclusively for Jews. And if any Palestinian dared to disrupt that dream, they would meet the same fate as Jerusalem and Haifa, villages reduced to rubble, ports wiped off the map by airstrikes, streets littered with the corpses of thousands of Palestinians. Those who were lucky enough to survive were expelled, doomed to live as refugees for the rest of their lives. From the very start, the Zionist movement carried a zero-sum slogan, us or them. There was no room for compromise, no space for coexistence. Even when Arabs made up 70% of the population and controlled 90% of the land, the Zionists stuck to their equation. And 75 years after Ben-Gurion declared his dream, Israeli society has ensured that equation remains intact, at any cost. Inside Israel, Jewish citizens enjoy full rights and privileges. Palestinians, they face systemic discrimination in every form. As Israel's current leader Benjamin Netanyahu put it bluntly, Israel is not a state for all its citizens. It is the nation-state of the Jewish people and the Jewish people only. If you are Palestinian, born and living on historic Palestinian land, your fate is determined before you take your first breath. And depending on where you live, that fate falls into one of three categories: Palestinians inside Israel, Palestinians in the West Bank, and Palestinians in Gaza. There are 2 million Palestinians inside Israel, citizens on paper, making up 20% of the population. But in reality, second class at best. From childhood, you receive fewer years of education than a Jewish Israeli. Why? Because even though 2 million people speak Arabic, their language is not officially recognized. If you manage to graduate, get a job, and earn a promotion, your salary will still be lower than that of a Jewish Israeli. And even if you accept all of this and say, fine, I'll just focus on my family and move on with life, Israel won't let you. You are legally barred from bringing over family members who live outside Israel. And even if you completely abandon your identity and attempt to convert to Judaism, Israeli law ensures that your path will be blocked or made nearly impossible. But even with all these obstacles, you are still among the luckiest Palestinians. Here, 2.7 million Palestinians live under direct Israeli military occupation. Their existence resembles a prison system, walled-off sectors controlled by military checkpoints. To move from one area to another, you must pass through countless military barriers. What should be a 5-minute walk can turn into hours of inspections, interrogations, and humiliation. And surrounding you, over 130 illegal Israeli settlements home to 500,000 settlers. Between 2017 and 2021, the Israeli army granted just 33 building permits to Palestinians in the West Bank. Meanwhile, they demolished over 1,150 Palestinian homes and issued over 1,100 new construction permits to illegal settlers. If your home is destroyed, you can't even set up a tent to shelter your family without Israeli approval. And guess what? That approval will never come. Where are we supposed to go? We don't care. Figure it out. And then there's Gaza, where 2 million people live on a strip of land just 360 square kilometers in size. There are no walls, no checkpoints, because the entire territory is a prison. No ports, no airports, no trains. Nothing enters or leaves without Israel's approval. According to some reports, Israel even calculates the exact caloric intake allowed per person, determining how much food enters Gaza, ensuring people don't starve but never allowing them to thrive. 90% of Gaza's water is undrinkable. 80% of its population relies on international aid to survive. Electricity is a luxury, not a guarantee. Gaza requires 560 megawatts of power to meet basic needs, but only receives 200. Unemployment sits at 50%. Most schools have been bombed to rubble. Although Israel no longer occupies Gaza militarily, it has turned it into an open-air prison. One so extreme that even the International Committee of the Red Cross has called it a blatant violation of the Geneva Convention. Israeli academic Oren Yiftichel describes Israel as an ethnocracy, a state designed to serve only Jews, and such a system cannot exist without devastating consequences for those outside of it. A state of apartheid. That's not my opinion. That's the conclusion of Noam Chomsky, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and even Israel's own education minister. Apartheid isn't an accident. It's the inevitable outcome of a project that prioritizes identity over humanity. That says your ethnicity determines your rights. That strips Palestinians of those rights simply for existing. The world must wake up. Palestinians deserve dignity, not because of politics, but because they are human beings. We've traced the roots of this reality, examined how it started, how it evolved, and how it became so entrenched. Maybe by understanding this grim reality, we can begin to imagine a better one. And that, more than anything, is what makes us human.